Right, well, welcome back after lunch. I hope you've had a sustenance to keep you going through the afternoon. My name is Maurice Gleeson. I run the Spirin One Name study, and it gives me great pleasure to chair the session this afternoon and to introduce to you Dr. Tyrone Bowes. Now, Tyrone has first done a DNA test in 2004 because his particular Bowes surname was blocked at his great-grandfather who died in World War I. And he was an only child, and there wasn't any additional information about him before that. So for 6 years then, the DNA sat there, and Tyrone didn't really tell Tyrone anything about his particular family line. But then in 2010, he looked at the results again and noticed that there was an association with Carrolls and Dooleys. And then when he went back into the ancient manuscripts, he found that Carrolls and Dooleys were associated with the Bowes surname. And it was at that point that Tyrone became interested in surname mapping. And for a year, he sat in front of his computer mapping the surnames, Irish surnames, based on the 1911 census and compiling a database of those surnames. He then went on to find a company based on that idea called Irish Origins, and that is an excellent website. We'll be looking at some of it today. But it has an incredible database of Irish surnames. It also includes a database of every castle in Ireland. And those are Norman castles, Irish castles, some Viking castles, there's a few of them, but also Gallowglass castles and Scots plantation bones. So a huge amount of work has gone into Tyrone's website, and he's going to take us through some of that work today. Now, Tyrone has a PhD in neuroimmunology and worked on autoimmune neuropathies for his sins, of which there are few. He has worked in Dundee, he has worked in Galway, and he has also, since launching Irish Origins, he has launched Scottish Origins and English Origins. Most of his work today is taken up by doing case studies for people who have had their DNA done and want to find out what surname associations there are with their surname and where the likely point of ancestral origin of that particular surname comes from. Very, very important if your particular surname is multi-origin in nature. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to present Dr. Tyrone Bowes, and could I ask you all to put your hands together and give him a big warm welcome. Thank you, Tyrone.
Can everybody hear me? Is that okay? Yep. Thank you very, very much, Maurice, for that. I'll give you €50 afterwards. Anyway, sorry. Okay, so now I didn't really start off as a genetic genealogist. It was purely a hobby of mine. And it's the nearest thing I come to a hobby because I've got 3 kids and they're quite young kids, so you don't get much time for anything. And I spent most of my, until recently I was making recombinant antibodies, very specialized. But basically, you know, I'll give you a little bit about myself. What I'm really interested was, how did my ancestors get to Ireland? My surname is Bowes. You know, I grew up in Ireland, and there's very few Bowes, and the Bowes that I knew were distant relatives. And it wasn't made any easier by finding this guy in Dublin. Now, this is Lord John Bowes, Lord Chancellor of Ireland, buried in Christ Church Cathedral, Dublin. I seen this guy when I was doing a school tour, and I was convinced then that we had an English connection. We're probably, you know, maybe distant relatives to this guy. Fell on hard times and, you know, lost out on all the money. He's the Lord, after all. And there's not much of a family resemblance there, is there? So, but, you know, I was interested, as a biologist then, on finding out what the DNA could tell me about my origin, okay? Now, in my day-to-day job, surname distribution mapping is a big part of that. I look at the surnames that appear in your DNA results and pinpoint or identify a common area of association. And I'll guide you through that. And as I say, this is a scientific approach, and I'm really exploiting the link between the Y chromosome, the surname, and land, which are typically passed along the paternal line. And it's, if surnames were passed along the maternal line, I'd be looking at mitochondrial DNA. So it's just the way things have worked out. As Morris mentioned, day-to-day work, I'm full-time. It's not company as yet. It's just sole trader, purely because it's just easier to set up. And I do personalised case studies reports. So people come to me with their DNA results and want me to make sense of them. Now, I can't do it for everybody's. And there's a sort of sliding scale of success rate it works best for those with Irish. Then, for Scots, it's quite good. But when you get to England, there's a couple of historical and cultural factors that make it a bit more tricky. And as Mark said, I launched Irish Origins in 2011. And that was followed because I was getting Scottish and English customers by Scottish and English Origins. Now, Welsh Origins I've always pushed further and further down the line. But a big part of my work is looking at place names, and I don't speak Welsh. So it's, when I come to do case studies for Wales, it's tricky for me. So I've got one or two, not enough to put it up there and launch Welsh Origins, but I hope to do that someday. Now, Now, I have to give you a little bit about the science of surnames, because as I was an academic, I could get these journals that were coming out looking at science, particularly surnames and relatedness. Now, that interested me as a scientist. So I'll give you a little bit about those surnames. Now, Ireland is great because the surnames are usually son of, grandson of, follower of. So they're like a genealogical record in themselves. So that's quite a bonus. Now, elsewhere in Europe, that can be quite different. They're probably rare. In Britain, it's usually occupational, denote physical characteristics, or derived from nicknames. So Ireland has got some benefits going for it when you're doing this type of analysis. Okay, so this is a little bit of science. Now, all I want you to concentrate on is, so what they actually did was they looked at 67 guys called Sullivan. 67 guys picked at random, and they tested their Y chromosome, see how related they were. And what they found was that 50% of Sullivans they tested were descended from a common male, one guy, who lived about 1,200 years ago. And the other 50% had acquired the surname over the last, or since that surname had appeared. So they're the non-paternal associations. So there's your core group, all related to that Sullivan Adam. I'll call him a Sullivan Adam, the guy who founded that surname, first took the surname. And when I was doing my mapping, what you could really tell is that, well, Sullivan is also associated with a single geographical area, and this is 1911. So Sullivans are still found in the area where that surname first appeared. Now, if I take another example, they looked at Donohues. There's lots of variations of this surname, but they're all so they looked at all the variants. They looked at 73 guys called Donohue, and what they discovered with Donohue is that there was 3 founders. And there's a 50% chance if you're a Donohue, you're related to one of these 3 Donohue Adams. And when I looked at the distribution mapping for Donohue, you got it mainly in 3 different areas: Cork, Kerry, Galway, and Cavan. Now, there's a little group down here in Wexford, but that's probably one of these groups has probably migrated to one of these locations at some stage. But you've got 3 main geographical origins, and you've got 3 founding ancestors. So 3 different guys living in 3 different parts of Ireland, but they pick a similar sounding surname. Now, so if you're going to take something away from this, you got your surname Adams, as it were. Usually, particularly in Ireland, you got one guy picks a surname, passes it on to his offspring. And I'd say about a quarter of our surnames are actually unique, and that means they're only found in one specific area. So they only arose in one specific area. And if you have that surname, that's great. It's very easy to determine where your ancestors came from. Some surnames, like Donohue, there's multiple founding ancestors. And it's only really the DNA that can tell you which Donohue Adam you descend from. And again, there's also that 50% rule, and this seems to be remarkably consistent through DNA studies and surnames and relatedness, that in the 1,000 years since the surname appeared, 50% of people will be descended from a surname Adam, but 50% will have a non-paternal association. But surnames were evolving, particularly in Ireland. So you had to have done something notable to get your own surname. And if you look at the Sullivans, this is quite a well-characterised one. So we have this Sullivan Adam, grandson of the dark-eyed one. Or there's a couple of translations for that. But he has some sons, but he also has some grandsons. And one of these earns the surname McGillicuddy. So, sometimes based on genealogies, and these are medieval genealogies, that these guys and these guys share common ancestry. And as there are some well-characterized genealogies out there. Now, often you take some of this with a pinch of salt. The relationships are reflected here. But there are some truths in it. But if you look at the McGillicuddys and you look at the Sullivans, they do appear in the same part of Ireland, down here, Kerry. And Kerry is a large place, so how am I going to sort of localise in on an area? Now, county level is fine, but, I grew up in Ireland. I know that most surnames, you still got farmers farming the lands where their ancestors lived when they first picked their surname. So you can look at where farmers with each particular surname are found. Now, if you do that, so this is one of the maps I made, and this just plots farmers and where they're found with each surname, where they cluster in 1911. And if you can see here, you can see Sullivan's here, McGillicuddy's here. So they're pretty much neighbours. And based on the genealogies, that they should show common ancestry. And this would also explain why if you're So this would explain why if you take a DNA test and you're a Sullivan, well, if you see McGillicuddy's in there in your DNA results, that's merely because it's reflecting they're from the same lineage and they live in the same area. Okay? So you would, if you're a Sullivan, you wouldn't be surprised to see McGillicuddy's in your DNA matches. Now, some points of note. Now, obviously it's not a perfect method. Some surnames aren't linked to the land. And, maybe, I don't know what percentage of English surnames don't have farmers farming in a particular area with that surname. But that is a problem. But then you've also got the advantage that some English surnames are maybe arose in towns, like Cheshire or York. So that actually makes your job a lot easier. Now, the Industrial Revolution as well, that's weakened the link to the land, particularly in England. Not so much in Ireland, but particularly in England and Scotland. And what I recommend is that, you just try and use some earlier census data if you're going to try and plot surnames or farmers with each surname. And of course, surnames change over time. Much like DNA, they mutate, evolve over time. And then there's the non-paternal events. So I always get sort of people saying, well, what about the non-paternal events? Well, I'll try and put that into perspective because those non-paternal events are happening between neighbours. And the longer your ancestors have been living in an area, you're going to accumulate non-paternal events with those neighbours. Okay, so plotting surnames. Now, when I started this, so these are free DNA surnames databases. There's my own there if you're interested in Irish surnames. But of course, in hindsight, I thought to myself, I should have plotted just farmers, because most Irish surnames, 99% of them, they have some sort of residual link to the land. Farmers are still in that area farming. And that would have probably cleaned up this map quite a lot, this map here. Now, the other database is GB Names Public Profile, a great database. If you're looking at your DNA results, you just want to see the surnames that are in there, go to this. And it also has a worldwide. But the disadvantage is it's all at a county level. And it's not discriminating, so there's no, it's not selective. It's plotting everything. Typically, these maps plot everybody with a surname where they're found. So there's no selection. And also, what I noticed when I looked at British maps was that the boundaries change over time, and that's a bit of a problem when I'm trying to look for consistency through time periods. 1841 county boundaries are different from 1881. Now, so plotting in the modern age. Now, many of you are probably familiar with Google Earth, and I've sort of progressed onto this. It's free to download, and the website is there. It's a great little resource. And this is what it looks like. And the great thing in Ireland is that you can plot to within, in Ireland, a townland. And I'll show you what a townland is now in a second. But you can also, in Britain, plot the parishes. They're all there. You know, you just pop in a place name here. Actually, all right, so first I'll show you, I might mention townlands in this, and people ask me what are townlands. So Ireland, if you look at a map of Ireland, they've divided Ireland into 62,000 geographical land divisions. And these are very old land divisions, probably date from Norman, and probably some of them are pre-Norman times. And this is just showing details from it here. And they're extraordinarily detailed, these maps, because you can literally see the the land divisions here. This is the townland, the red line. And some of them actually carry surnames. This is Ballymaddock, so Maddoxtown. This is the middle of Laois. So you got 62,000 of these place names, which are a wealth of information. Many of them reflect the clans or the families that either arose there or settled there. Okay, so back to Google Earth. Now, it's great. I'll say you want to plot some data, you could click on Add here. You can search for the location. So you have some data from your census. You want to plot where these farmers were in this census. Pop in the address, parish level. Sometimes I check, you know, if they've given the name of a road or something or a lane. You might find it on Google Earth, and that gives you that little extra layer of specificity. But you can pop it in there, and then you can fill all sorts of details. Now, from your point of view, you might have details on a particular guy in a particular location and his whole family tree, and you can link that in this here. You can add whatever you want to this, okay? So it's a very, very useful tool, and I use it day to day. Now, the other useful thing is that you can actually zoom in on an area. You get a roadside view. And many of you would have probably used this, but I use it when I'm doing my case studies. And what's great about this is Dyke Road and Galway Sea. I live quite close to this, and the reason I'm showing you this is because, for two reasons. There's me there. I'm in Google Earth. There you go. I was back in 2010, I think, when I was still a stem cell making recombinant antibodies on my way to work. And I noticed this thing going by. I didn't know what it was at the time. But what's great is, if you look just across the road, there's an old tower house or a fortified house here. And I know that was built by the Burke family. And the great thing about Ireland is that you don't have to look too far to find evidence of some surname and its association with an area. So as I say, there's a wealth of information, and this is, you know, actually another interesting story is that they were digging up, so they've put a footpath up here leading to the motorway here, and they dug up some bodies in that field there. And of course, straight away I was interested in trying to get some DNA from these bodies, see if you could put surnames in. Unfortunately, you can't. Of course, I emailed the DNA guys. You can't. DNA is too degraded. You know, maybe that'll get better. But it would have been great. It would have made a great story. These three bodies dug up, and you can put a surname to them. Probably try and find out where they were or how they got there. Okay, so as Morris mentioned, it's great because you can link this information you put on Google Earth to your website. And this is the castle locations. But you can put anything in there. If you use surnames, people with a surname, particular area, all the details, people can zoom in. This is it. You can zoom in on this map. You can click on it. You can call up the information. This is a De Lacy Castle. This is Trim Castle in Meath. And this is built by the De Lacy family. So it's absolutely fantastic. You can link this to your website. So, what data to plot when you're using Google Earth? Well, I work, 1911 is good for me for Ireland. And that's particularly, people say, well, why didn't you use earlier? Well, because there's not much difference between 1911 and 200 years earlier. You've still got the same surnames, the same farmers with the same surnames farming the same area. Okay? And actually the benefit with 1911 is that the surnames are standardized by then. So I recognize them. They sound to me familiar as surnames today, Irish surnames today. If I looked back in 1841, a lot of them be Gaelic, and I'd be struggling to find out what is the anglicised version. So 1911 works for me for Ireland. UK, I found, if I could go back earlier than 1841, I probably would. But I think 1841, most of you would have access to that. It's a good enough search. And you know, you still, if your surname is linked to the land, you'll still find it linked to the land in 1841. Okay, so as I say, when you're plotting, this is a demonstration of the sort of increased resolution you get when you're using Google Earth compared to just mapping on a county level. So this is the Murphy. Murphy is by far the most common surname in Ireland. And when I'd done this, distribution map here in 2010, I thought, well, based on the distribution, there's 4 major clusters of Murphys, probably 4 distinct Murphy clans. Now, when I plotted farmers, I didn't plot every farmer. That'd take me, I'd still be working on that if I'd still plot every farmer. But I set a threshold of every Murphy farmer that's maybe 70 years of age. He's the head of household, 1911. And what I actually found was there's actually 17 major clusters of Murphy farmers. Okay, so that's, you know, that's quite a lot compared to what I'd initially predicted based on just the distribution mapping alone. So it gives you increased resolution. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Now, I've made a number of databases. I've got a sort of townlands and a place names database for Ireland. And when I looked at these Murphy farming clusters and where they're found, and then I looked at townlands that are related to the Murphy clan, or Murphy surname, and I hope you can see this. But there's a Murphy cluster up here. This is Armagh Murphy, or this is Monaghan Murphys. If you look at where the Murphys are found, there's 3 Murphy place names right next to where you find that farmer cluster. And they're townlands. They're very old, probably predate the Normans. And they probably denote Murphy territory, original Murphy territory. If you look down here in Armagh, there's another cluster down here, and there's some more Murphy townlands down here. So there is a correlation between place names and clusters of farmers with a particular surname. And then there's another example here in Cork. You see here, there's a Murphy cluster here, and it's right in the townland called Ballymurphy Upper and Ballymurphy Lower. And then if you look at the other group, in the southern Cork, again, you've got Murphy place names, so there's a correlation there. And this is probably why I haven't done my Welsh origins yet, is because I can't get to this level doing the Welsh case studies. Okay, so now surnames evolve. So sort of probably one of the most frequent emails I get is, you know, my surname has an E in it. My name is Kelly, but it's Kelly E-Y at the end. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. You know, surnames evolve much like the DNA. So don't worry, don't get too hung up on it. And this is a nice little example. This is Bowes Pub, and this is in Dublin. But if you look at the sign, it's B-O-W'-S, okay? Now, they must have been too lazy, because if you look in the windows, there's no apostrophe. And if you look in this sign here, there's no apostrophe. And if they ever paint this over, that'll probably be gone over time. So it's little subtle changes like that. Now, we don't own this pub, by the way. And it'd be a bad idea for my ancestors or relatives to own a pub. So I wish, but we're probably related. These guys are probably Bowes or Bow. And we probably do share a common ancestor somewhere down the line. Okay? Now, okay, so I'm going to give you just a quick example of surnames and exploring similar sounding surnames and relatedness. So this is McEnany. Now, I might have showed this here. Oh, yeah. So there's 2 examples here I've shown. So McClave has become hand. Clave means clove or love is hand in Irish. So sometimes McClave has become hand. And for McEnany, Hain is bird in Irish. So McEnany has sometimes become bird. That's what they tell you in all the books. But let's explore that a little bit more. And this is McEnany. So when I'm looking for all the variants, farmers with each surname is invariant, and I'm plotting where they're found. And what you do see is a nice little cluster here. That's a typical Gaelic Irish surname. It arises in a single location, but the surname changes as you move away from that central location. I'll show you that. If you zoom in here, you've got a nice little core group of farmers, and these are McEnanys, mainly McEnanys. You can't see the colour too well, but they're mainly McEnanys. And as you move away from this core cluster, the variants, here's a variant, McNeely. Here's another one. This is a great one, McNancy. You know, McNancy is not, it's not a unique, or it's a variant. And it's a variant of McEnany. And you could see what happens here. The E, somebody's writing this down, and he writes down a C instead of an E. And it's a very simple mistake to make, but this is what happens. And I get emails from a person going, we're McNancy's. I can't find McNancy's. It's McEnany's. And if you look at the DNA, which I show you, you'll see how that is confirmed. Now, bird is interesting because not all birds are McEnany's in disguise. Now, I'll just go back to that one. If you look here, you've got bird down here and here. It's spread out. Now, it's these guys here who are found close to the McEnany's. They're probably McEnany's, given their location. They're quite close to McEnany's. It's probably arose as they moved away. It was anglicised. But not all birds in Ireland would be McEnany's. Okay, now here's a group. So what I want to show you and demonstrate here is that a lot of my customers are American, and they'll email me saying, right, this is surname Farris. Now, I've done this little sort of study for the Farris group where I plotted all the variants I could find, farmers with these surnames, and where they cluster. And, you know, what if you're an American and you don't know where your Farris ancestors came from? It could be from any one of these locations. So how do you decide which one? And it's in the DNA. It's in your DNA results, which will shed light on which cluster your Farris ancestors come from. Because you can see, actually, that if you're Scottish lowlander, well, let's call them Farish or Faries, they eventually become Ferris. As they move away, they become Ferris. And that's in Ireland, because if you look in Ireland here, all these guys here are plantation Scots, Faries or Farish. It's not an Irish surname, they're plantation Scots, but the surname has changed as soon as they get to Ireland. Now, but in their DNA results, these guys are going to match Elliots, Armstrongs and Grahams, surnames you find in the Scottish lowlands. These guys are English Ferris, and you'd expect to see them matching Coates, Taylors, surnames you'd find down there in the south of England. Now these guys, now here's where you can track your ancestors if he's migrating. Because if your ancestor was a Ferris from this area, and he goes to Ireland during the Norman times, well, then you'd expect to see matches to Coates, Taylors, reflecting the sort of his roots in England. But you'd also see matches to Sullivans, O'Learys, and McCarthy's. Non-paternal events that are being accumulated in the time in Ireland. And I'll show you. Now, as I said, I can usually spot Norman surnames based on their distribution. If you look at all Norman surnames in Ireland, this is their distribution pattern. Heavy in the southeast, where Normans arrive, and then they pan out. And if you look at Norman castles, so this is just showing you Norman castles and where they're found throughout Ireland. And you can see the sort of areas where Gaelic Ireland survived. But you can see, you're just literally seeing where all the Normans settled. And if I explore the Ferris in Ireland a bit more, now you've got to remember, they've been in Ireland for about 800 years, far longer than they were in England. They spent maybe 2-3 generations with their surname in England, ended up in Ireland. And they've been there long enough that they've given their names to at least one townland, Dunferris, and they're also associated with Castle. And if you look at this distribution, it's far more scattered than what I showed you with the McEnany's. And that's how I know that's a Norman surname, or that surname is of Norman origin. Okay, here's just a Stuart one. Now, I'd done a case study for a lady, and she was Stuart. Now, the DNA pinpointed her ancestors to the Dunduff Stuarts in Ayrshire. But she knew that her ancestors had come via Ireland. So they were of plantation stock origin. So how do you track your ancestor once they're on the move? There's a DNA option, but the DNA, you've got to remember, it's 1600s. It's the presence in Ireland is not being reflected in the DNA because it's too recent. So I had to try and figure out, well, how can I try and figure out where these guys might have settled? So I had to look at the records. Now, if you look at plantation bonds and where they're found, anything there in yellow is a Stuart plantation bond associated with a Stuart branch of the Lowlander Stuarts. So there's about 6 of them there, I think, Stuart plantation bonds throughout Northern Ireland. Now, if you look at just one of these groups, and this is the group near Fort Stuart, there's a lot of Stuarts there in 1911. There are probably not so many there nowadays. But this area gave rise to a couple of prominent Stuart branches in Ireland, the Ballylawns, the Rameltons, and the Raphoe. But I can trace back, so first of all, you can find physical trace of these guys because this is remains of the old Stuart fort, Once again, it's Google Earth, you can zoom in. So you can find traces of these guys and some of the place names, the plantation bonds. But the history of the plantation was very well characterized. So I can, looking at her, I know that she's Dunduff Stewarts. There they are there. But there was also these other branches, the Fintalloch. Now, it gets, trying to figure out how these guys are all interrelated can be tiresome. But I know that these Fintallochs are claim descent from the Garleys, or the Earls of Galloway. But in each area, they acquired land. So these were landowners in Scotland, they acquired land in Ireland, and they settled in particular areas. And the Stuarts were still clustering in those areas in 1911. Now, so using this method, remember her objective now is to discover where her Stuart ancestors settled in Ireland. Well, based on the study I've done, these guys up here, the Raphoe Stuarts, are the best ones she should concentrate on to do a DNA test to confirm the link. So this is her target now, is to trying to get some people, that's a challenge, to DNA test from that area, some Stuarts. Now, okay, so that's purely the sort of surname distribution aspect of the stuff that I do. Now I combine that with the DNA results, and I'll show you two case studies, one Irish, one English. Now, I just have to give you a little bit of science, sort of refresh your memories on the DNA test results. So all the DNA testing company is doing is they're harvesting your DNA, they're amplifying it, so they're looking at the Y chromosome, and you've only got that from your father, so this is only a test that can be done by males. But all they're looking at is 67 or maybe 37 bits of your DNA, and they're comparing them to everybody else who's tested. The more markers you share, the more recent your common ancestor lived. So what you're actually getting, now if they let you see all your matches, you'd see a sort of chronological time frame of shared ancestry from the present day right back to the dawn of time, okay? And at some point along this, surnames appeared. Now, I use surnames as a time point, not DNA mutation rates. We know surnames appeared roughly 1,000 years ago, or paternally inherited surnames, I should say. And in this method, I'm exploiting the link between the Y chromosome, surname, and land, which are typically passed along the paternal line. This is what allows me to use this method. Now, I rarely use SNPs, and I do now when I'm trying to reconstruct distant ancestry, because my customers always come back wanting to know more. Didn't expect that, but they want, right? You found my ancestor in Scotland. Where was he before then? So and SNPs are useful in that sense, so I started working a bit more with SNPs. SNPs are just particular mutations, very specific mutations. Okay, so this is my Bowes results. Now there's two things. If you've never seen DNA results, you only get two things with your DNA results. You get the people you share an ancestor with, based on the DNA results. And here you go. So you can't really see the surnames there. I'll show you now in a minute. But you also get a little bit on your SNP, your haplogroup. And I know, looking at this SNP here, it says P312. You can do a little search, and you'll find out that SNP is 5,300 years old. That's no use to me if I'm trying to find out when and where my ancestor, my Bowes ancestor, the first guy to pick that surname, lived. That's not much use to me. So, now as a scientist, 2004 I couldn't have done this method because I didn't match that many people. And I didn't see a pattern. But when I when I went back to these results in 2010, I noticed something. First off, I matched others called Bow or Bowes. I had no idea who these people were. They tested independently of me, but I share a common male ancestor with them, a founding Bow ancestor. Now, I also matched other people. There were surnames that reappeared through my DNA results. So it wasn't random. This isn't random. There are particular people with different surnames that always appear as a match. Now, you can't see here, but green is Bow or Bowes, red is Carroll, yellow is Flanagan, and blue is Dooley. So there's a pattern there. This is DNA. DNA doesn't lie. There's shared ancestry with these guys. I've got to figure it out. Now, so that begs the question, how can I share an ancestor with these people with different surnames? Unless my ancestor, their common ancestor, preceded the appearance of surnames. So if I examine where all these surnames appear or occur in census data, I should find an area common to all. And this is the sort of theory I came up with later to explain this. Back then I was just looking to find out where Bow, Carroll and Dooley occur. So, now this is a scientist in me. I literally go through all these results, count how many people with these surnames appear as a DNA match. Now straight off you can see Carroll. There's 15 different guys called Carroll I match. Flanagan there's 7, Dooley there's 8. So Bow, Carroll and Dooley, and there's a couple, and I've colour-coded them for sort of ethnicity. So Flanagan, Carroll, these are Irish ones. The blue ones are Norman or English. And then we've got a little Scottish one down here. Now black could be anything. Could be English, Scottish, Irish, don't know. But these are the 3 that I concentrated on, Carroll, Dooley and Bow, purely because of their frequency. And straight off, so if you look at surname distribution mapping alone, there's a tenuous sort of ancestral link with Laois. Laois is one of the least populated counties in Ireland, but yet these surnames are showing a link there. So there has to be something there, and I have to explore that a bit more. So what's happening? So this is the scenario that's happening. So 1,000 years ago, you got a bunch of Gaelic Irish, a tribal group, related males, they're all related to each other. It was safety in you know, living with your relatives. So they're interrelated males. But it's time to take surnames, and this guy becomes O'Carroll. This guy O'Duvlach or Dooley. So I've given they're Irish, and then they're anglicised what they become. Tracy, Bow, my ancestors, Flanagans, and Kellys. And this is where I've placed all these surnames in the areas where you find them today. Farmers with those surnames. Now this is where it gets interesting. So how do I explain all those Norman surnames in my DNA? Well, in 1169 AD, the Normans arrived. And all of a sudden you've got all these neighbours, these new neighbours, foreigners, very different, speaking English, or mainly, probably French, I don't know. But, you know, they're only human, and you're getting intermarriage between these Gaels and Normans. And that's being reflected in the DNA results. If you look at my DNA results, I've got Purcells, I've got Norman, so you very rarely find Fitznorman in Ireland, it's Norman, and Powell. Now the Springers are interesting because that's a later non-paternal event. They can trace their ancestors to Barbados in the 1600s. And a lot of Irish ended up in Barbados. And there was a name change and a change of faith. And when I first got an email from this guy, he says, "This is great. Where are your ancestors from in England?" And I had to say, well, DNA is pointing to Ireland. So there was, 1600s, there was a name change. And you don't find Springer in Ireland. So it can't be in Ireland. It has to be later. And it was the Barbados link. So here's where, if you look at my map, so this is my sort of business plan when I first started this. I'd sell this map to people, and they'd go through their DNA results, they'd do it themselves, and they'd plot where all their reoccurring surnames are appearing. They'd see a pattern, and they'd go, yep, bingo, my ancestors were in Laois. But they don't want to do that. They typically want me to do it for them, which I'm not going to complain about, because I quite like doing it. But what you find is, you know, you've got the Normans down here, you've got a pattern there. It doesn't occur anywhere else. Now, but I'm a scientist, so you can take this a step further. Let's look for more evidence. You can look at historical evidence. Is there any sort of castles or something associated with these families that I can concretely link them to that area? So not just farmers. What about place names? A wealth of information on place names, historical records. Is there anything to say my ancestors were in that area? And then there's the DNA evidence. So you can explore each of these, and I'll just go through them one at a time. So this is where I plotted. So I realised that some of my customers, probably about 12% of people coming to me with Irish ancestry would have Norman ancestry. And the best way to track your Norman ancestors is to follow the castles. So they invade, they conquer, they settle, they build a castle. You just follow the castles. So if I break down Little Laois, this is Laois, and this is where the Bow farmers are. And if I plot where all the castles are, all these ones here in this dark green area here, they're all O'Carroll castles. They were the big guys. I got 15 matches to O'Carrolls in my DNA results. This is O'Carroll territory. So when you plot these castle locations, I realised as I was plotting them that I'm uncovering a sort of map of the prominent clans and families in Ireland. And your DNA results will typically reflect shared ancestry to at least one of them. Now, there's always the exception, but most of the people coming to me, they'll have a link to one of the big families in their area. And this is, so I reconstructed this map. And if I look at my DNA results, there's County Laois, there's the Bow farmers. These are my biggest matches, DNA-wise, the O'Carrolls. Then I got matches to Kellys, Purcells, more Purcells, and Normans, Fitznormans. There's the Normans down there. So, let's look at the place names. Now again, I had to sit down and there are a wealth of information. The place names, and there was an awful lot. I haven't identified all of them, but I've gone through most of Ireland. And this is just showing you a little snapshot of all the place names in Laois, near the border with Kilkenny. Now, if you look where Bowes farmers are, I nearly fell off my chair when I found this. Bowes Crossroads, right here, next. And, you know, that dates from about 1841. It's not a townland, but it's a place name I know was there in 1841. So it probably predates that. So, and if you look in the surrounding area, so when I'm trying to pinpoint my customers' origin, I usually aim for a 5-mile radius, because you find a core cluster of farmers within that 5-mile radius. And this is the 5-mile radius for the Bowes farmers. And if you look within that, you find Bow Crossroads up here. There's a Castle Uboy over here, nothing to do with my ancestors. This sort of is the name of the territory, Ubu territory over here. Now you've got a Tubberbow down here. That could be a reference to my ancestors. Unfortunately, Bow could translate as well as a cow in Irish as well. So whether it's Cow's Well or Bow's Well, I'd lean towards Bow's Well. But you find Dooleys, who also appears in my DNA matches up here, and there's a Dooley Crossroads here. So these families are leaving evidence in the place names. So historical records. Now this is out of my field, and I usually send people to experts in this field if this is what they're interested in. So I asked a guy in Galway, I said, listen, see what you can find regarding Bowes in that area. He's a medievalist, so medieval times. And this is what he came back with. And I was surprised. I was very surprised. Now, first of all, this is telling me two things. So these are all references to my ancestors in the Bow, Kilkenny, Laois, Kilkenny, Tipperary borderlands. But you could see straight away, you've got all these guys. Now, John has always been passed down through my, first son of the four sons, always been John. This could be a reference to my ancestor. Don't know. But straight away, I know that they're Gaelic Irish because they've got the O apostrophe. And the Normans, this is the Norman area. These are Norman records. Remember, there's Norman areas and there's Gaelic Irish areas. So if you're looking for Norman references in Norman Ireland, you go to the Tudor fiends. And if you're looking for a reference to your ancestor in Gaelic Ireland, you go to the papal registers. And he found references to both. So they were living in this sort of borderland between Gael and Norman, the Gaelic and Norman worlds. But these are all references. And this is probably the closest I'll ever get to the Uboy, is the original Gaelic Irish. Okay, so historical evidence points me there, and this is the last bit of stuff he dug up. So this is a poem written 600 years ago, but it describes the O'Carrolls, those big guys that I matched on a big territory out there in Offaly. And he's describing this guy in this poem. He's describing the kingdom of the O'Carrolls from the time of Brian Brew, which is quite appropriate because we're coming up to that 1,000-year anniversary of the Battle of Clontarf from Brian Brew in Ireland. And he's describing the O'Carrolls. Now, here's my DNA matches. In my DNA matches, it mentions I match Carrolls, Flanagans, Dooleys, Egans. Now, the O'Carroll territory is split into 8 sort of sub-territories. 3 of these appear in my DNA results. The O'Carrolls, of course. The O'Flanagans, there's the O'Flanagans. O'Hegans, now Hegan's an obsolete surname, they become Egan and Dooley. So my DNA results are reflecting what is in a poem that's 1,000 years old. So, but the ultimate evidence is in the DNA. And anyone with a connection to Laois, Bow, who's been recruited from this area, has been a DNA match to me. And also they've actually tested the clan chief, or descendant of the clan chief of the O'Carrolls, and he's a DNA match to me. So this links my ancestors back to this small area of County Laois. Of course, I thought we were royalty when I started this out, Bowes line. I thought maybe a bit of royalty, but no, it's a bit less, a bit more, bit of a letdown. Anyway, final thing, I know one of the speakers touched on linguistics. Now, I missed that talk. I didn't get in until late. But it's interesting because Abu translates as victorious. If you look at, and I live in Galway. So in Galway, their sort of motto is Gallav Abu, which is Galway victorious. And if you look at Boudica, it's the same, shared. These are similar languages. Boudica translates victorious. And if you look at a map of Roman Britain, at least some of these tribes had shared ancestry. So the Brigantes are there, and this is the, I can't see that, but the shared tribal groups, and so the linguistics is probably reflecting some of this. And if I go back enough, I'd probably show my DNA, the shared ancestry in Britain. Okay, and that's something I'm going to do. So the last case study I'm just going to show is an English example. So it does work some of the time. Probably about 40% of the time, people with English ancestry come into me. I can pinpoint an English origin, as it were. Now, this is from this is Mr. Bennett. Now, he runs the Ipswich, Massachusetts DNA study, and they're trying to figure out where their Bennetts originated. And he runs this website here, Ipswich Bennetts. Now, he emailed me his files. So typically, if I'm doing analysis, you can email me files. I'll look through it, and I'm scanning through the surnames, doing analysis. Now, I've just highlighted all the surnames, the recurring surnames. So he matches other Bennetts. That makes my job a bit easier. So it's not a non-paternal event. He matches a Bennett Adam, as it were. But he also matches some Locks and Seymours. And there's a couple of singular matches there, Coat and French. So that gives me something to work with. Now, again, if I look at his haplogroup, it's not much use to me in this instance because his haplogroup, the nearest he's got is L23. Now that's a couple of thousand years old. Again, that's preceding surnames by a couple of thousand years. So I don't look at the haplogroup. What I'm looking at is the surnames, particularly Bennett, Locke, Seymour. Now, phallus or follis is too far removed to be any use. So remember, you're looking as you look down your DNA matches, shared markers. You're looking further into your distant ancestry. So this shared ancestry down here, this level probably precedes appearance of surnames a couple of hundred years. So I don't include phallus or follis in the analysis. But I do include those Coat and French. But when I look at the surname distribution map on publicprofiler.org, what's it showing me? It's showing me, yeah, there's a link there to England. But, these are common surnames. I've put the numbers of people with the surname in brackets here, 49,000 Bennetts. And the lesser spelling variant is 4,000. So that's not really telling me very much. What is interesting is a singular match to Coat. Now, Coat is one of those English surnames. Now, in Scotland, that would be Coates, E-S. But in England, it's Coat, C-O-A-T. And that's interesting because it's only in one area. But when I look at farmers and where they appear in 1841, so we're going back 40 years earlier. Now, if you look at farmers and where they cluster, sorry about the colours here, but highlighted in blue, when I plot where farmers with these surnames, where they cluster or where they're found in census data, there's two areas. Two areas that his ancestors could have been in. There's Somerset and then there's Yorkshire, Lanarkshire. Or Lincolnshire, sorry. Yeah, Lincolnshire. Now, so I've narrowed it down to two areas. Now, I can start plotting those farmers and those surnames because my idea is this. Those surnames arose among related males in a particular area. So they should cluster in one area, but not the other. Because they arose among related males. And when I do that, you can clearly see that they're only clustering down here in Somerset and they don't cluster together. So those surnames didn't arise among related males here, but they did here. And as I say, some of their descendants are still there in 1841. And then I go to the place name level, so trying to identify place names. So there's a nice little cluster of Bennett's farmers near Bournemouth-on-Sea. And they're surrounded by Seymours, Locks, Coates, and French. And then when I look at place names, I find a Bennett Road. Now, I can't find out how early that Bennett Road is. But I also find Seymour Road, Locks Way, Lockswell, Coates Farm, and this time it's with an E, and Coat down here, and Seymour's Court over here. So this is the area where his ancestors originate from. And it gives him an area then to go and DNA test. Now this is where it gets problematic, because whereas in Ireland you can still find, say, Flaherty's out in Galway and you can still recruit them and DNA test them, I don't know what the likelihood is of finding Bennett's in and around this area who are still farming in that area. But it gives him somewhere where he can go and do DNA testing. So just a summary. So I progressed to Google Earth. And I think it's just, it's a very useful tool. You can build up your own database. You can do what you want with it. And you can examine particularly surnames and place names. And actually, if you go to Google Earth, you can just pop in a part of a place name or surname, and it will call up a road or a lane with that in it. So even a partial search, you'll get it on Google Earth. You might get lots of them. You've got to trawl through them and find out which one is in Somerset. So it's very useful. So hopefully you all will do DNA testing to sort of enhance your studies. But also it gives you an opportunity to reconnect with the history. I was surprised. I didn't expect to find any references to my ancestors from the 1500s to the Bow in Laois, but they were there. So I'm always amazed what they managed to dig out from the sources. Now finally, the sort of challenge of modern genealogy is to connect your paper trail to the area pinpointed by the DNA. And whether that's possible, I don't know. I haven't seen it done yet, but maybe that's a challenge for you guys. But it just remains for me to thank you all and take any questions if you have them. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyrone. Who would like to kick off with a question? You have a question here at the back. Let me travel. I'm going to lose weight doing this. There we go.
I just, when you said you're doing your matches on your 37 and 67 markers, how close a match are you looking at in there?
So on the results, they'll only show you to a certain level. I did put I have worked out the sort of chronology of the shared ancestry. So if you match somebody exactly, your shared ancestor is anywhere between present day and 200 years ago. If you match -1, it's between 200 and 400 years ago. So you can go back using that sort of time frame. And I've based that on a name change for a Valentine who was originally a McGregor, and that's pretty consistent. So, look for close matches, -1, -2, -3, -4, -5 at 67, and look at all your matches at 37. Yeah. Okay. But recurring genetic matches is probably key.
We have a question here from Brian.
It's only really a comment, Tyrone.
Yep.
Help may be on the way for you in Wales. I can't remember who's running it, but again, very recently they've announced they're collecting the sort of place farm names project for the whole of Wales. So when that gets online, that hopefully should be a bit equivalent to your Townlands type system.
I'd say if you're linking surnames to an area, place names are key. And actually, there might be a wealth of information in early maps. I'd love to see all these sources.
Specifically for farms and those sorts of things, for the analogy you had.
Yeah.
I know it's been done for Pembrokeshire specifically. There's a 2-volume place names of Pembrokeshire, but they're planning to do it for the whole of Wales, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I have a quick question. In the next 5 years, where do you see this going?
I'd like to see it completely automated. So it takes me out of the equation because I think it can be automated. It's looking at data, census data, place names data. You could all link that back to a Google Earth map, and you could generate an automated report. So, and there's only so many case studies I can do, but I'm sure this can be automated. And that's something I'm sort of exploring at the moment. Yeah.
And what about in terms of DNA and the fact that we're getting lots more SNP markers arriving in the next 5 years?
I'm sort of playing a waiting game, so I want to see what is revealed with the SNPs. there's no real stopping this. I'm only pinpointing an ancestor to a specific time point, which is when he picks his surname. But if your ancestor was Norman, well, he was only there for a little while. He was moving, he was, conquering, settling. He's left a DNA trail all the way back to Scandinavia, and you can probably follow that back if you use the SNPs and reconstruct all of that using that, yes.
We have a question here and then another comment from Brian.
It's only because I think I'm right, neither of you were here yesterday when Dick Eastman did his talk, and he would have talked specifically about where he thought DNA would go in terms of the future in relation to the healthcare overlaid on all of this as well.
Oh, I don't get involved in the healthcare. I don't want to know. My ancestors haven't lived particularly very long, so I don't want to know my risk factors.
My name's David Cuffley. We've started a DNA testing and relating the document proof. I've got a couple of doubts with what you've been saying today, and one of them is place names. There's 3 place names for Cuffley in the UK. One in Northumberland that derives no Cuffleys whatsoever.
Yeah.
We don't travel further north than about the Wash.
There's a key to that. So, if you look at Irish place names, there's a lot, and a lot of them could be misinterpreted. But you could also, the key for me is, if there's a farmer cluster close by, then it's highly likely that the place name reflects the farmers with that surname. If there's no Cuffleys ever recorded out there, I disregard it. It's probably just changed over time to resemble the surname. So I look for the link where you see the surname being there and the place name. That's what I'd look for. Now, they're not always going to be there.
That's an Irish answer to my question, which is English, but just leave that one aside.
Yeah.
The two other places, one down in Hampshire and the other one is Hertfordshire. The Hampshire place name, we've now got the family back into Hampshire.
Yeah.
So that one's reasonable.
Yeah.
The other one, of course, is in Hertfordshire, and it's the dominant location.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that we're using the relationships that's on family tree DNA as the relative number of markers. And on 111, we've got 10 related families. 4 are Cuffleys, 3 are Crouch, 1 Stevens, 1 Douglas, and 1 Van der Polk.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of MPEs going on.
Not necessarily. I wouldn't look at 111 markers because not everybody tests to that level routinely. I'd look at 67, and see your recurring surname matches. And some of them, like Couch and Cuffley, may localise to the same area.
Well, they do, and this was the next point I was coming back. In England, it's manorial records that we've been looking at.
Yeah.
And it's the manorial records that are telling us that there's Cuffleys in Hexton
but then that's an advantage.
Quite a distance.
But that's an advantage because we don't have that in Ireland, and maybe in the Irish case, I have to rely on the place names, whereas in an English sense, you have the records. You see?
Right. Yeah. Okay. But they are travelling fairly large distances. I, like you, used to use 5 miles.
Yeah.
But 20 miles seems.
And if you look at my
reasonable.
English case study, it is a bit more. Yeah, it probably shouldn't apply to England. It should be a wider area. In Ireland, 5 miles, you'll find that in that cluster. In England, it's going to be larger, yeah.
Yeah. Certainly from Hexton in Hertfordshire, the distance they're travelling is about 20 miles on the outskirts when you start plotting them.
Yeah. If you try and keep the farmers and where they're found, then they're not going to move too far. They're going to pass that land through the generations. But obviously, a lot of surnames don't have a link to the land in England.
Because they're manorial records, they are linked to land.
Oh, okay.
And the 20 miles is still land that's being worked within the manorial system.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Finish.
Great. Well, I think that's just about time because we are going to be treated to Dick Eastman speaking again. So can I ask you to put your hands together and give a big round of applause for Tyrone Bowes. Thank you very much.